decided to talk about one of my interests, which is huts. And when I say huts and sheds, I'm meaning all sorts of buildings, so cabins, shacks, shelters. So I can hear.
Yeah, there we go.
So shelters, huts, cabins, shacks. What I'm really interested in is the construction techniques behind these, ranging from the really primitive, the hammer and the nails, found windows, found materials, right through to the really expressive, highly kind of conceptual piece of design. This building was made by filling a hole with hay bales, filling the outside with concrete, and then once it's set, moving in a cow for a year. It wasn't meant to be, but it then ate all the hay bales and left this really kind of a highly designed cavernous space inside. So that's quite a kind of like conceptual piece of construction. Huts can be really functional and utilitarian. This is Ernest Shackleton's Antarctic base camp. So it's stacked high with rations, food, stove, furs. It's the very essence of survival against sort of harsh conditions on Earth. Equally though, huts can be highly expressive. They can be objects of art in their own right. I think crucially, through all their diversity as objects, the one thing that unites them is that they're all really small. I think it's quite important to keep these things small because the act of doing that means that you're kind of distilling it down to what's really important and kind of condensing its essence into something through the process of miniaturising it. Huts are deeply rooted in our primitive nature. The whole idea of architecture begins with a cave and then moves really quickly on to the idea of the primitive hut and the built shelter. They're designed responses to the basic needs of human beings. The first of these needs is the protection against the harshness of nature, to give us shelter from the storm. This is a cabin in the Netherlands which is built for men lost at sea, so it's stacked with fresh water and ship's biscuits. Its first duty is to protect the inhabitants from the harshness of nature, but in doing so, it gives a place to the lost. So we kind of see like a physical function gives rise to an ideological one. If you look at huts in general, you do actually realise that they're quite often ideological places, a scene or a setting to house the things that are secondary to survival, fundamentally are human acts. The act of building a hut can be a device for the pursuit of creativity, to create a place to think, a place for daydreaming. The idea of the hut and the shed is really important to an awful lot of artists. It has been quite sort of prominently throughout the last 100, 200 years, 300 years. I think it's because the act of removing the workspace from the living space itself is a small act of escapism. It's a deliberate shift in perspective towards what we normally see as the ordinary or the everyday. So from the studio you look back at the house representing the everyday or the day-to-day. You look back at it from an external place, so you gain an outside perspective on something that's often too introverted to see in its entirety from within. Often huts and shacks are really interesting, not because of what they contain, but from what they choose to leave out. The hut's actually something that's really deeply rooted in society, and this is kind of evident throughout the entire world. The idea of escapism is particularly prominent in kind of huts in Scandinavia, where they're called hutas. 1 in 8 Scandinavians has access to a huta. They're quite often shared between generations in the same family. It can be a statement of resistance as well during the days of the DDR, during the time of the Berlin Wall. The citizens of the Deutsche Democratic Republic would escape the uniformity of these communist block houses, and they would kind of escape that to the makeshift huts that they had on the rivers and lakes near Berlin. So the part of uniform communism was swapped for nudism, volleyball, and a really simple living by the water's edge. There's another hutting community closer to home than that, with Carbeth outside of Glasgow. Some of you may have kind of been through it or seen it. That was a working class reaction to the poverty of interwar Glasgow, an escapism of the dirty streets and overcrowding to a quiet place in the country. The active rural escapism here longingly echoes the reversal of the Highland clearances, whereby crofters were moved en masse from the Highlands to city centres and thus created the problem of overcrowding in the first place. Here the hut feels more like a love letter to a past in danger of being lost underneath the march of industrial progress. So, with the last couple of slides, this kind of brings me up to where my own work comes in. These designs for huts that I've created came about through wanting to kind of work on that theme of reconnecting people in lost places. And that came from travelling right around Scotland and just sort of mountain biking, surfing and walking, and just always stumbling across ruined croft houses, ruined farmsteads, and all being incredibly beautiful places. And then just try to kind of work out a way that this could be accessibly repopulated on a sort of temporary basis. So I've developed a series of small huts which I'm kind of building just now. Unfortunately, it's just a massive pile of wood at the moment, so I can't really take many photos of it. But the idea is that by building them in panels in a workshop down in Falkland, they can then be sort of really easily slotted into lost places. I guess you can kind of follow the website a little bit if you want to know more about it. Hope I've heard that, sorry, it was a bit quiet. Cheers.